My daughter told me at our family dinner. You really don't have to call me your daughter anymore. I think I am more comfortable with Mom's new boyfriend, and I don't want to hurt his feelings. I smiled and just nodded. I was sitting at the table like I was a stranger. Nobody wanted to talk to me, and quickly brushed off anything I said like I didn't exist. When it was time to pay the bill, the waitress was directed to me. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. Before we continue, support us by clicking on the like button, tell us in the comments section where you are watching us from, and click on the subscribe button so that you don't miss our big story tomorrow. Now let me tell you what happened from the beginning. You really don't have to call me your daughter anymore, she said, not even looking at me. She was tearing a piece of bread in half, her fingers steady, her voice casual, like she was commenting on the weather. I think I'm more comfortable with Mom's new boyfriend, and I don't want to hurt his feelings. I smiled because that's what I had trained myself to do when something landed wrong. I nodded once, slow and polite, the way people do when they're trying not to disrupt a room. Inside, something tightened, but I didn't touch it yet. I sat there, fork resting on my plate, realizing the sentence had already rearranged the evening, and maybe more than that. The restaurant had been my suggestion. Neutral ground, I'd said earlier, somewhere quiet where we could all just eat and talk like a family again. It was a small place with warm lighting and soft music, the kind that made conversations feel private even when they weren't. But once we sat down, the table arranged itself around him. Chairs angled subtly in his direction. Laughter timed to his jokes. Even the way the server leaned in when he spoke felt different. When I tried to add something, about work, about a memory, about anything, it slid off the table and onto the floor, unnoticed. I felt like a guest who had arrived too early and stayed too long, tolerated but unnecessary. I noticed the way my daughter didn't meet my eyes after she said it. That detail mattered more than the words themselves. If she had looked at me, maybe I could have pretended it was a clumsy joke, a poorly phrased boundary, something we could clean up later. But she didn't. She reached for her drink, laughed at something her mother said, and the conversation moved on without me. I stared at the condensation sliding down my glass and wondered when I had become optional. I didn't confront her. Not then. I already knew that whatever I chose to do next wouldn't happen at this table. But it would happen. The waitress came back to ask if we wanted dessert, her pen hovering above her notepad. My daughter answered for everyone without asking me, ordering 2 to share and waving off the idea of a third. We're good, she said, smiling brightly, the same smile she used when she wanted things to go smoothly. I nodded again, out of habit, even though no one was looking at me. The clink of silverware and the murmur of nearby tables filled the gaps where my voice might have gone. I checked my phone under the table, not for messages, but for grounding. The screen lit up, time still moving, proof that the world hadn't stopped just because I felt erased. When the bill arrived, it landed in the center of the table like a test. For a brief moment, no one reached for it. Then my daughter pushed it gently toward me with 2 fingers, careful not to spill her drink. He's got it, she said to the waitress, not as a question but a decision. There was no glance my way, no acknowledgement that this might be a conversation. I picked up the check and scanned it, my name nowhere on the paper, but somehow written all over it. I paid for what I had eaten, slid the folder back, and said calmly, "You'll need to cover the rest." My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. She snapped then, sharp and sudden, like a wire pulled too tight. "Wicked man," she said, loud enough that the table next to us went quiet. "You never cared about us. I'm glad Mom moved away from you." The words were practiced, rehearsed somewhere I hadn't been invited. For a second, I thought about responding, about listing the years, the sacrifices, the quiet ways I had shown up. But I didn't. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and left. I didn't look back. I already knew that staying would cost me something I wouldn't get back. The walk to my car felt longer than it should have. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a notification I ignored. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel like they belonged to someone else. I wasn't angry yet. That came later. What I felt then was a hollow kind of clarity, the kind that shows up when denial finally gets tired. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I drove home in silence, already understanding that this evening would not stay contained to itself. By the time I unlocked my front door, the house felt different. Not emptier, just quieter, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I set my keys down, loosened my tie, and sat on the edge of the couch without turning on a light. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. "You embarrassed me," it read. No question mark. No follow-up. I didn't reply. I stared at the dark screen until it went black again. I knew then that this wasn't about one sentence or one dinner. It was about roles that had shifted without permission and expectations that no longer matched reality. I replayed the moment at the table over and over, not to punish myself, but to understand it. The way everyone had adjusted around someone new. The ease with which I had been sidelined. I realized I had been negotiating my place for a long time, accepting smaller portions of respect in exchange for peace. I had told myself it was temporary, that relationships ebb and flow, that patience would be rewarded. Sitting there alone, I finally admitted that patience had turned into permission. That recognition didn't make me feel better, but it made me feel awake. Later that night, another interruption grounded me back in the present. A knock at the door, my neighbor returning a package that had been misdelivered. We exchanged a few polite words, the normalcy of it almost jarring. When the door closed again, I leaned against it and exhaled. The world was still functioning. People were still kind. This situation was specific, not universal. That mattered. I went to bed knowing sleep wouldn't come easily, but also knowing something had shifted inside me. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't made any declarations. But the ground had moved. I didn't make any decisions that night. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I finally stopped pretending the dinner had been a misunderstanding. It was a message, delivered clearly, even if it was wrapped in casual cruelty. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aware that whatever came next would be irreversible. I hadn't chosen my response yet, but I knew I would. And when I did, it wouldn't be for their comfort. It would be for my survival. "Wicked man, you embarrassed me." Her voice came through the phone in a voicemail I hadn't answered, sharp and rehearsed, like she had practiced it on the drive home. I listened to it once, standing in the kitchen with the refrigerator door still open, cold air spilling out onto my ankles. She didn't pause for breath. She didn't ask why I left or whether I was okay. She told me what I had done wrong, as if the entire night could be reduced to my failure to play along. I closed the fridge without taking anything out, already aware that this message was less about the dinner and more about who she believed I was allowed to be now. 2 days passed before I let myself replay the dinner without flinching. Time had a way of sanding the edges off moments, turning them into something you could examine instead of survive. I noticed details I had skipped before. The way she'd spoken on behalf of everyone, the ease with which she assigned me responsibility without consent, the certainty in her voice when she dismissed my presence. None of it was accidental. It wasn't teenage impulsiveness or a moment of emotional overflow. It was practiced comfort, the kind that comes from knowing you won't be challenged. That realization hurt more than her words. It meant this dynamic had been forming long before I noticed. By that weekend, the messages kept coming. Short at first, then longer, then angrier. She accused me of abandoning her emotionally, of making everything about money, of refusing to accept her mother's happiness. Each message carried an assumption that I owed her continued access, continued patience, continued silence. I read them once and didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that responding would only confirm her belief that I existed to absorb her disappointment. I needed to know what would happen if I didn't soften the impact for her. I suspected the answer wouldn't be pretty. I met a friend for coffee that Sunday, someone who had known me long enough to remember when my daughter still reached for my hand in public. We talked about neutral things at first, work, weather, mutual acquaintances, but eventually the conversation found its way to her. I described the dinner without dramatizing it, sticking to facts, watching his face tighten anyway. He didn't rush to defend me or criticize her. He simply asked, "When did you start apologizing for being there?" The question landed heavier than any accusation. I didn't answer right away because the truth was uncomfortable and familiar. That night, I sorted through old paperwork looking for something unrelated and found a folder labeled with her name. Inside were school records, certificates, handwritten notes she'd given me years ago. One card read, "Thanks for always showing up." I sat on the floor longer than I intended, the interruption grounding me in the contrast between then and now. I wasn't nostalgic, I was analytical. I traced the shift from gratitude to expectation, from appreciation to entitlement. I saw how my consistency had been reinterpreted as obligation. The love hadn't disappeared. It had simply become conditional, contingent on my usefulness. On Monday morning, I received an email from her, not angry this time, just cold. She wanted to talk things out, but only if I was willing to apologize for making a scene. The phrasing mattered. There was no acknowledgement of her words, no curiosity about my silence. The condition was clear: reconciliation required my submission. I closed the email without replying and stared at my screen until it dimmed. I wasn't ready to confront her, but I was done negotiating reality. I could feel a decision forming, slow and deliberate, like a muscle I hadn't used in years finally engaging. Midweek brought another external interruption, small but clarifying. A notice arrived in the mail about the house. Routine paperwork, nothing urgent. But seeing my name alone on the envelope reminded me of something fundamental. Some responsibilities were mine alone, and some boundaries had always been within my right to enforce. I wasn't obligated to explain myself to anyone who refused to see me clearly. That thought didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel steady. For the first time since the dinner, my chest didn't feel tight when I thought about her. I started paying attention to my own habits, the ways I anticipated her reactions before making decisions. I realized how often I framed my choices around avoiding her disappointment, even when it came at my expense. That pattern had felt like love. Now it felt like erosion. I didn't blame her entirely. I had taught her what to expect by never correcting the imbalance. That awareness didn't excuse her behavior, but it clarified my responsibility moving forward. I couldn't control how she spoke to me, but I could control whether I stayed in the room for it. By Friday, the silence between us had hardened into something tangible. No new messages. No calls. I suspected she was waiting for me to break first, to restore the familiar rhythm where I reached out, and she decided whether to respond. I didn't. I spent the evening reorganizing the house, touching objects I hadn't moved in years, reclaiming space without announcing it. Each small action felt like preparation, though I didn't yet know for what. I only knew that whatever came next would not involve pleading. I went to bed that night with a calm I didn't trust yet. It felt earned, but fragile, like ice just thick enough to stand on. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't explained myself. But I had stopped absorbing the blame for a dynamic I no longer accepted. I understood now that love offered without boundaries becomes something else entirely. I didn't know how she would respond when she realized I wasn't playing my old role anymore. I only knew that the next step would force a reckoning, and I was done pretending it wouldn't. "You embarrassed me." The text arrived 2 days later, mid-morning, while I was in the middle of a meeting I barely registered. The words sat on my phone screen, stark and unpunctuated, like a verdict. No greeting, no context, just that. I read it once, then again, noticing how easily she had shifted the center of the story back onto herself. There was no curiosity about why I had left the table, no acknowledgement of what she had said to me in front of everyone. The sentence assumed something dangerous. That my role was to explain myself, to make it right, to restore her comfort. I locked my phone and already knew I wouldn't respond. By that afternoon, another message followed, longer this time, padded with justification. She told me I had made things awkward, that her mother's boyfriend was just trying to be nice, that I should have understood the situation better. The more she wrote, the clearer it became that she wasn't interested in understanding me, only in correcting my behavior. I sat at my desk long after work hours ended, the office lights humming softly above me, and realized how familiar this pattern was. She expressed disappointment. I absorbed it. She moved on. I stayed behind, carrying the emotional cost. That rhythm had shaped our relationship for years, and I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I didn't reply that night. Instead, I went home and cooked dinner for myself, Something simple, eaten standing up at the counter. The house felt quiet but not lonely, a distinction I hadn't appreciated before. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed again, this time a call. I let it ring. I watched the screen light up and go dark, resisting the urge to justify my silence with an explanation I hadn't been asked for. I reminded myself that distance was not cruelty. It was information. How she responded to it would tell me everything I needed to know. The next morning, she tried a different approach. The message was softer, almost conciliatory. She said she missed me. She said things had been stressful. She said we should clear the air. But even then, there was a condition tucked into the language, subtle but unmistakable. We could talk, as long as I was ready to admit fault. I stared at the words and felt something settle in my chest, heavy but clarifying. I understood then that forgiveness had become a one-way street. I was expected to offer it freely, repeatedly, without receiving accountability in return. That imbalance had finally exhausted me. An external interruption pulled me out of my thoughts later that day. A coworker stopped by my office with a question unrelated to anything personal, her presence grounding me back in the present. We talked for a few minutes, exchanged mundane updates, and when she left, I noticed how easy the interaction had been. No defensiveness, no emotional negotiation. Just mutual respect. The contrast was stark. It reminded me that relationships didn't have to feel like tests you were constantly failing. That realization didn't erase the sadness I felt about my daughter, but it reframed it. The problem wasn't that I was difficult to love. It was that I had accepted a version of love that demanded self-erasure. That evening, I found myself revisiting old memories, not the sentimental ones, but the moments I had minimized at the time. The casual dismissals, the assumptions about my availability, the way my needs were framed as inconveniences. I saw how often I had forgiven without being asked, smoothed over tension before it could become conflict. I had told myself I was protecting the relationship. Now I recognized I had been protecting an illusion. Forgiveness, when it isn't paired with change, doesn't heal anything. It just postpones the next injury. Midweek brought another message, this one sharper again. She accused me of shutting her out, of being emotionally unavailable. The irony wasn't lost on me. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed another, then erased that too. Every version sounded like a defense, and I was done defending my right to exist without apology. I put the phone down and went for a walk instead, letting the physical movement burn off the restless energy building inside me. With each step, I felt the decision solidifying, not impulsive, not reactive, but firm. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to her, forwarded from an old account I still managed. It was administrative, nothing dramatic, but holding it in my hands felt symbolic. Another reminder of the ways our lives were still entangled, often by default rather than intention. I set it aside unopened, aware that disentanglement would require deliberate action. I wasn't there yet, but I could see the path forming. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about refusing to continue a cycle that demanded my silence as proof of love. By the weekend, the silence between us had stretched long enough to feel intentional. I imagined her telling the story to others, casting herself as the one who tried, the one who reached out. I accepted that I might become the villain in her version of events. That possibility no longer terrified me. I was tired of contorting myself to fit narratives that erased my experience. I spent Saturday organizing documents, making quiet decisions about my space, my time, my boundaries. Each action was small, but together they felt like preparation for something larger. I went to bed that night knowing the escalation was inevitable. I hadn't confronted her. I hadn't laid out terms or issued ultimatums. But I had stopped cushioning the consequences of her behavior. I had withdrawn the endless forgiveness that required nothing in return. I understood now that boundaries often look like abandonment to people who benefited from your lack of them. Whatever happened next would force the truth into the open, and I was ready to let it. She came home that evening to find her belongings outside. I didn't watch it happen, but I pictured it anyway. The way the door wouldn't open, the brief confusion before realization settled in. I imagined her standing there, keys in hand, rehearsed anger suddenly displaced by something sharper. I had changed the locks earlier that afternoon, quietly, methodically, without the drama people imagine accompanies moments like that. There had been no shouting, no trembling hands. Just the sound of metal clicking into place and the understanding that I was drawing a line I would not erase later out of guilt. The decision hadn't come all at once. It had built itself in layers, each ignored message and misdirected accusation adding weight. That morning, I had stood in the hallway looking at the room she still occupied in my home. Not physically anymore, but symbolically. Her things were scattered the way they'd always been, as if permanence was assumed. I felt a familiar urge to delay, to wait for the right moment, to soften the impact. But I had learned that waiting usually meant abandoning myself. So I packed carefully, respectfully, placing her belongings in boxes without anger. Respect didn't require access. While I worked, my phone buzzed repeatedly on the kitchen counter. Calls, messages, missed notifications piling up like static. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't trying to punish her with silence. I was protecting myself from being pulled back into an argument where my reality would be treated as negotiable. Every few minutes, some external interruption pulled me out of my thoughts. A delivery truck outside, a neighbor mowing their lawn, a calendar reminder chiming softly. The world continued its rhythm, indifferent to the emotional earthquake I was navigating. That steadiness helped more than any reassurance could have. By the time I finished, the boxes were lined neatly by the door. I hesitated only once, holding a framed photo from years ago. I didn't linger over it. I wrapped it carefully and placed it with the rest. The act wasn't about erasing history. It was about acknowledging that history alone didn't grant unlimited access to my present. I set the boxes outside just before dusk, the sky dimming into that quiet blue that makes everything feel suspended. I locked the door and sat down, my pulse steady, my mind clear in a way it hadn't been in weeks. The call started almost immediately after she arrived. I let them ring. Voicemails stacked up, each one escalating in tone. Confusion turned into outrage, outrage into accusation. She demanded explanations, justification, reversals. She told me I was heartless, cruel, dramatic. I listened to none of it in real time. I knew better than to engage while emotions were peaking. Silence, in that moment, wasn't avoidance, it was containment. I refused to provide her with an audience for a narrative that painted my boundary as betrayal. Later that night, a third party reached out. Her aunt, careful with her words, neutral but concerned. She asked what had happened, framed the situation as a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. I told her simply that I had set a boundary and needed space. I didn't justify it. I didn't recount the dinner or the messages. I let the explanation be incomplete. That choice felt radical. I had spent years over-explaining myself, hoping clarity would earn understanding. Now I understood that people determined to misunderstand you don't need more information, they need your compliance. Sleep came in fragments. Each time I woke, my phone was quiet, the earlier storm exhausted. I lay there thinking about how boundaries feel to the people who benefited from having none. They experience it as sudden, unreasonable, cruel. They don't see the slow erosion that made it necessary. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad and resolved and strangely grounded. For the first time, I wasn't bracing myself for the next emotional demand. I had already said no, not with words, but with action. The next morning brought another interruption that anchored me in practicality. A routine email from work, a reminder about a meeting later that day. I showered, dressed, moved through my morning like someone who had accepted a difficult truth rather than someone reacting to a crisis. I noticed how calm my hands were as I poured coffee. That detail mattered. It told me I hadn't acted impulsively. I had acted in alignment with something I'd been ignoring for too long. By midday, the messages resumed, this time peppered with guilt. She accused me of abandonment, of choosing control over compassion. I read one message in full, then deleted the thread. I didn't block her yet. I wasn't ready to sever everything, but I was done engaging. I reminded myself that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice, and that choosing silence over explanation was sometimes the only way to prevent further harm. I had explained myself enough over the years. The explanations hadn't changed anything. That evening, I walked through the house and noticed the absence, not just of her belongings, but of the tension that had accompanied them. The space felt lighter, not because I was relieved she was gone, but because I was no longer performing emotional labor in my own home. I sat at the kitchen table where I had once planned meals around her schedule, and I let myself feel the grief without trying to solve it. Grief didn't mean I had made the wrong choice. It meant the choice mattered. I knew then that this wasn't the end of it. Consequences rarely arrive all at once, and I wasn't naive enough to think this boundary would be respected immediately. But I also knew I wouldn't undo it out of discomfort. I had chosen silence deliberately, not as a weapon, but as a shield. Whatever came next would build on this moment, whether she understood it or not. I didn't know yet how far this would go, but I knew I wouldn't step back over the line I had finally drawn. By the time she got to work the next morning, the email was already there. I knew the timing because she told me later, her voice shaking, rage and disbelief tangled together so tightly they sounded almost the same. But when it happened, I wasn't watching a clock or waiting for confirmation. I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing a mug I hadn't finished, listening to the radio murmur something forgettable in the background. The world didn't pause for this moment, and neither did I. What happened next had been set in motion long before that email ever reached her inbox. I didn't celebrate. That mattered to me, even then. I sat down at the table and felt the weight of what I had done settle into my chest, not as guilt, but as gravity. People like to believe consequences come from anger or spite, but this one came from exhaustion, from clarity, from the long realization that protecting someone who refused accountability had been slowly dismantling my own stability. I had drawn a line, and the ripple effect was unavoidable. I knew she would call it cruelty. I knew she would never describe it as cause and effect. Her call came less than an hour later. I didn't answer it right away. I let it ring until the sound stopped meaning anything, until it was just noise echoing through the room. When I finally listened to the voicemail, her voice cracked halfway through her first sentence. She called me wicked again, louder this time, as if volume could rewrite reality. She said I had ruined her life, that I had taken everything from her, that this proved I had never loved her at all. I sat there and let the words pass through me without grabbing onto them. They no longer had hooks. What she didn't know, and what I wouldn't explain, was how long I had held things together quietly. How many times I had intervened without acknowledgement, smoothed paths she never knew were rough, absorbed consequences meant for her because it was easier than watching her struggle. I had told myself that was what parents did, but somewhere along the way, that belief had turned into a trap. Love had become indistinguishable from rescue, and rescue had become an expectation. I wasn't withdrawing support out of anger. I was ending a pattern that had outlived its purpose. An external interruption broke the tension that afternoon. A coworker stopped by to ask about a report, completely unaware of the personal earthquake still reverberating through my day. We talked numbers, deadlines, ordinary things. I appreciated the mundanity more than I expected. It reminded me that my identity wasn't limited to the role I had played in my daughter's life. I was still competent, still respected, still grounded. That context didn't erase the pain, but it kept it from swallowing me whole. Later, another message came through, this one from her mother. It was brief, clipped, careful. She said she didn't understand how things had escalated so far, that this felt extreme, unnecessary. I read it twice and noticed what wasn't there. No mention of the dinner. No reference to the words spoken across that table. No curiosity about my experience. Just a quiet expectation that I would explain myself yet again. I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in litigating my boundary with people who had ignored it until it inconvenienced them. That evening, I took a walk through my neighborhood as the sun dipped low, the air cooling just enough to feel intentional. I replayed the accusation, wicked, and examined it honestly. Was there a version of events where my actions looked cruel? Of course. Boundaries often do, especially when they arrive after a long period of unchecked access. But cruelty implies intent to harm. What I had intended was to stop bleeding quietly, to choose stability over chaos, to refuse to be the only adult in a relationship that demanded my silence as proof of love. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No new messages. No calls. The absence felt heavier than the noise had, but it was clean, honest. I made breakfast and sat at the table without rushing, noticing how my shoulders weren't hunched the way they usually were. That physical detail grounded me. It told me my body recognized the shift, even if my heart was still catching up. I wasn't healed. I wasn't celebrating, but I wasn't unraveling either. That felt like progress. By midday, word had spread through the family in the way these things always do, fragmented, distorted, sharpened at the edges. I received a message from a cousin offering support, though the wording suggested caution more than empathy. I didn't correct the narrative. I had learned that defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you only deepens the wound. I didn't need to be seen as right. I needed to be intact. That distinction had taken me years to learn, and I wasn't about to unlearn it now. That night, I sat alone with the reality of what had changed. The relationship I thought I had with my daughter no longer existed in the form I recognized. Grieving that didn't mean I would reverse my decision. It meant I was honest about the cost. Consequences weren't revenge. They were the natural outcome of choices made repeatedly and without reflection. I had finally stepped out of the role that allowed those choices to continue unchecked. Whatever she called me after this, I knew one thing with certainty. I had stopped sacrificing myself to keep the peace. And there was no going back to that. I blocked her number after the last voicemail. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shaking hand hovering over the screen, no whispered apology to an empty room. I listened to the message once, all the way through, because I needed to be sure I wasn't acting out of anger. Her voice was tired this time, stripped of the sharp edges she'd used before. She didn't apologize. She didn't reflect. She simply repeated the same accusation in a softer tone, as if volume had been the problem all along. When the message ended, I stared at the phone for a long moment, then tapped the screen and made the decision final. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. That silence forced me to confront something I had avoided for years, the difference between love and obligation. I had confused the two so thoroughly that untangling them felt like losing a limb. For a long time, I believed that being a good parent meant enduring anything without protest. That my discomfort was irrelevant compared to her feelings. But sitting there, phone finally quiet, I understood how deeply that belief had hollowed me out. Love that requires self-erasure isn't love, it's compliance. And compliance, dressed up as sacrifice, had nearly convinced me that I didn't deserve peace. 2 days later, an external interruption arrived in the form of paperwork I had been postponing. Administrative details, signatures, confirmations. Small things that nevertheless marked a shift. I handled them calmly, efficiently, without the internal debate that used to accompany every decision involving her. I noticed how different it felt to act without anticipating her reaction. There was grief in that freedom, but also relief. I wasn't bracing myself for backlash anymore. I wasn't preemptively apologizing for choices that were mine to make. Each completed task felt like a brick laid carefully into a new foundation. The family fallout continued in the background, as I knew it would. Messages filtered in from people who wanted to understand both sides, which usually meant they wanted me to soften mine. I declined politely, briefly, without elaboration. I didn't know anyone a narrative that made them comfortable. I had learned that clarity doesn't come from explaining yourself better. It comes from standing still long enough for the truth to settle. Some relationships shifted, some cooled. A few went quiet altogether. I let them. Not every loss is a tragedy. Some are corrections. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer, I found an old note she had written years ago, folded so many times it had gone soft at the edges. It thanked me for believing in her when she didn't believe in herself. I sat with that for a long time, letting the memory exist without trying to use it as evidence against my decision. The past didn't disappear just because the present had changed. I could honor what had been without sacrificing what was. That distinction felt important. It allowed me to grieve without collapsing into regret. I thought often about how she would tell this story to others. I imagined the words she'd use: cold, controlling, wicked. I let myself feel the sting of that. Then I let it pass. Being misunderstood is painful, but it's survivable. What I couldn't survive anymore was being diminished in my own life. I accepted that I might always be the villain in her version of events. That acceptance didn't come from indifference, it came from self-respect. I didn't need to be seen as good by someone who refused to see me fully. Weeks passed. The intensity faded into something quieter, more reflective. I settled into routines that felt like mine again. Mornings were slower. Evenings were lighter. I laughed more easily, slept more deeply. The absence of constant emotional negotiation freed up space I hadn't realized was missing. I wasn't over it, but I was no longer consumed by it. Healing, I learned, isn't a moment. It's a series of small decisions made consistently in the direction of dignity. One evening, a friend asked if I regretted how things had ended. The question wasn't accusatory, it was genuine. I thought about it carefully before answering. Regret implies a better alternative that was available and ignored. I didn't see one. Every path forward required a loss. I had simply chosen the one that didn't require me to keep disappearing. That realization didn't erase the sadness, but it gave it context. Some endings are necessary not because they're easy, but because they're honest. I didn't reach out again. I didn't wait for an apology that might never come. I understood now that closure doesn't always arrive in the form of reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, the moment you stop chasing understanding from someone who has already decided who you are. I had drawn my final boundary, not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but out of self-preservation. Choosing myself didn't mean I stopped loving her. It meant I stopped allowing love to be used as a weapon against me. Some people will call that wicked. Let them. I know what it cost me to get here. I know how far I was pushed before I finally stood still and said no more. If you've ever been made to feel invisible at your own table, if you've ever been punished for refusing to keep the peace at your own expense, then you understand this choice. I chose myself. Like this video, so more people who feel invisible in their own families can find it. Share it with someone who needs permission to choose themselves. And subscribe, because these stories don't end when the guilt starts. That's where they begin. See you soon in the next story.